Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about absolutism in France and Russia. You can see our SOL below. We're going to be talking about the age of absolutism and how it affected the monarchies or the rulers in this country and kind of how it looked in those countries. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, absolutism. What is it? It is a form of government where the ruler or the monarch has all of the authority in that country and there's no one to oppose him. There's no laws that limit his power. There's no one to oppose him. He has absolute rule over the entire country and the people in it. So there's a couple characteristics we'll talk about of absolutism. One, centralization of power. The centralization of power is simply that monarch, that ruler, has control or has power over all the people and all of the things that happen within their borders. They have all the power. They've centralized all the power. They've centered all the power in them. They are the ultimate authority in their borders. And that means that everyone in their country is their subject. So that is the centralization of power. That ruler has power over everything, every aspect of life, all the people within their borders. Second, rule by divine right. So all this means is that the monarch believes that they are appointed by God to be the ruler of that country. Rule by divine right means the monarch is appointed by God to rule that country. They are God's mouthpiece here on earth. They are his representative. The monarch is God's representative on earth. This also means that God is the only person that monarch has to answer to. He answers to no one else except for God because he is God's representative. So those are two important characteristics of absolutism. So absolutism takes hold in a couple European countries for a few reasons. The main idea is that it's the rise of monarchs. Monarchs in Europe are becoming stronger during this time period. And below are some reasons or some ways that they were rising to the top of power in Europe, why they were becoming more powerful. So one, end of feudalism. So with feudalism ending, these monarchs are getting more power. Remember, under feudalism, there were a bunch of lords under the king, and those lords ruled over their own land. So they all had a little chunk of land that they ruled, they controlled. And that means that the people who worked on that land paid taxes to their lord. Their lord was in control of deciding like court cases or making decisions among the people. He had law of the land. So those lords had a lot of power. When feudalism falls apart and there's no longer these lords that have power over the people living on their land, that power goes back to the monarch. So with the end of feudalism, more power is reverting back to the monarch. Second, the rise of cities. So with the fall of feudalism, cities begin to grow. People are moving to cities. People are starting businesses. Cities are beginning to flourish. And so there's a lot of wealth in cities. Well, there's no one to rule over the people of those cities except the monarch himself. So this is good. There's a bunch of individual people who are starting businesses, living in cities, and that means that the monarch can tax these people who are running successful businesses, and it just centralizes the monarch's authority. Next, growth of national kingdoms. All this means is that now that feudalism has ended and there's no longer these lords that are controlling chunks of the kingdom for the king, a national kingdom is emerging. The countries are looking more whole, and the authority for the monarch over those countries is the entire country, not these little chunks where different lords have power. Support for the middle class. When kings have power over their entire kingdoms, it makes things peaceful and things begin to prosper. So the middle class supported strong monarchies because they knew if there's a strong monarch in our kingdom, it's going to be peaceful and trade is going to flourish, business is going to flourish, and that's going to benefit us. The middle class usually were merchants or business people. They owned businesses. And so if it's safe to own a business and trade and the kingdom is wealthy and it's safe and people are prospering, that means that the middle class is going to benefit. So the middle class supported the king. Wealth from the colonies. We talked about France and Spain and England. They're getting these colonies. These colonies are sending back raw materials, resources, and wealth, gold and silver, to the monarch. So that is making the monarch more wealthy, and it's giving them more power. Last, Reformation and church power. With the Reformation, the church is losing power. The authority that the church once held over people, over its believers, now reverts to the monarchs. The monarchs become the guiding light or the rulers over people's individual lives and their day-to-day lives instead of the church. So that is how, those are the main reasons that the monarchs were able to rise to even more power after the end of feudalism, during this age of absolutism. So let's talk about absolutism in a couple of specific places. First, we're going to talk about France and Louis XIV. You can see the dates on the side that he lived and ruled. And when Louis XIV comes to power, he is a 4-year-old boy, so he's only 4 years old, and he has a cardinal, Cardinal Mazan, who's beside him there, listed below, and he is he like rules in his place essentially. He's his advisor because he's only 4 years old. And so he is making Louis's policy when he's still a child. Well, he raises taxes and tries to strengthen the monarchy for Louis. And so this makes him extremely unpopular with the nobility. So the nobility hate him, hates the cardinal, and because of that, they really dislike Louis, even though he's a child. And so they actually even plan assassination attempts on him, even though he's a child, and there's someone ruling in his favor, because they were strengthening the monarchy for him. So Louis grows up with this extreme fear of the nobility, and he vows when he is young that he will never fear the nobility again because he will become so powerful that they can't threaten him ever again. So when he becomes of age and he really takes over his own rule, he goes about centralizing power. Remember, that is a key concept for absolutism. So he centralizes power in himself, and he does this in a few ways. One, he excludes the nobles from his council. So instead of including nobles to advise him on his councils, he excludes them, and that lessens their power. They have less authority within the kingdom because they're not included in the decision-making of the kingdom. Second, Louis himself communicates with local officials. So instead of having a chain of command where someone else is reporting back to him, he communicates himself with local officials. This makes him in charge of and connected to everything that's going on in his kingdom. So again, that's how he's centralizing power. He is keeping his hand and his eye over everything that's happening in his kingdom. Third, he institutes mercantilism, that economic practice of mercantilism we've talked about. This just means that he is keeping all the wealth within, all the gold, all the wealth that's coming into the kingdom, he's keeping within the kingdom's borders, and all that wealth is his. As the monarch, the wealth of the kingdom is his wealth, so that makes him more powerful. And lastly, he centralizes power by making all of the nobles in his kingdom, all the big lords and big landowners in his kingdom, live at his palace of Versailles with him. This way he can keep a close eye on them. They can't plot against him. They can't become strong of their own because they are living at his kingdom and at his palace. He keeps an eye on everything that's going on in his kingdom. So he centralizes power in that way. And then under his authority, under his rule, France actually becomes a leading European power. They have a really large and advanced military. So that means they have a strong military presence. Their population is huge. Their population is 20 million people. It's 4 times larger than England at this point in time. So they have a really large population. This means more people for Louis to tax, more businesses that are running, more people to work the land. So he has a lot of people under him supporting his kingdom and the operations of his kingdom. And lastly, his palace of Versailles is a symbol, a status symbol for how wealthy he is, how prosperous the kingdom is at this point. That is a picture of it in the top corner. That's the Hall of Mirrors. So there's 14 huge mirrors down one side of that hallway, of that room, and on the other side there's 14 windows that mirror it. So it makes the room look really grand and large. It was really expensive. The Palace of Versailles cost $2.5 billion in modern money. It also was, it had 5,000 acres of garden. 5,000 acres of garden is unimaginable today. In that garden, it had 1,400 fountains just in the garden alone. There's too many fountains to even run them all the time. They only ran them on special occasions. And it took, I think, 36,000 workers to complete the palace. So it's a huge symbol of the success of France. However, eventually towards the end of Louis's reign, France begins to fail and fall from that leading power that it was. Louis leads a bunch of expensive wars that are unsuccessful and becomes really unpopular with the people, and the end of his reign is kind of sad. He's really unpopular. No one likes his reign. No one likes his policies and these wars he's leading. And so that is the end of Louis XIV's reign in France. Next, we're going to talk about Russia. First, we have to understand Russia is really different from the rest of Europe at this time for a few reasons. One, long-standing feudalism. Feudalism lasts in Russia until the mid-1800s. That's hundreds of years longer than the rest of Europe, which means that the power for a long time is still in the hands of those lords instead of the monarch. So feudalism lasts for a really long time in Russia. It makes it very different. The economy is very different from the rest of Russia. The Mongols had ruled Russia for a long time. The Mongols were in control of Russia. It's a different culture than the rest of Russia. It makes their clothing, their food, just all of the practices, those cultural practices are very different in Russia from the rest of Europe because the Mongols were in control of of Russia for a long time. Constantinople versus Rome. So Russia looks to Constantinople as their center of knowledge and culture and art. So instead of looking to Rome like the rest of Europe was, remember when we talked about the Renaissance and the Reformation, Rome is kind of that center of knowledge. It's coming from Greek and Roman classical ideas and thought and art and literature. Instead of looking to Rome, Russia looks to Constantinople, which was a Muslim-controlled city. So it makes it very different culturally from the rest of Europe. Russia only had one seaport, and it was a cold water seaport, so they couldn't trade. Sorry about the bell, guys. So it's a cold water seaport, which means that most of the year it's iced over because it gets really cold in Russia, and so they can't trade with other countries. So there's not a lot of influence coming into Russia. And last, Russia is Eastern Orthodox, so they're not Catholic, they're not Protestant, they practice a completely different religion, and they look at Europeans as being heretics, so they don't approve of the Protestant or Catholic faith that the rest of Europe is practicing at this point in time. So Russia is very different from the rest of Europe. So Peter I comes to power. He actually comes to power before 1696, but he's ruling jointly with his brother. But in 1696, he becomes the sole ruler, or the Tsar of Russia. And he had very different ideas on what would make Russia a strong power. So he goes on this grand embassy. His grand embassy is where he goes and he tours the rest of Europe. He goes and he looks at all of these Western European countries that are very different from Russia, and he sees what their culture is like, what their practices are like, what their economies are like, and he comes back and he decides that he's going to westernize Russia. He begins a campaign of westernization on Russia to make Russia more like the rest of Europe. So what does this look like? First, he has to make some reforms before he can westernize his country. So what are his reforms? State control of religion. So he takes the Orthodox Church and puts it under his control. He now controls religion in the country as well as the government. Next, the great lords are reduced. So he reduces the power of the great lords so that he can centralize that power under himself. Next, he modernizes their army. Just like France had a really strong army that had modern weaponry and modern tactics, he modernizes the army of Russia. And last, he finds people with really heavy taxes. So he puts heavy taxes on his country so that he can have more wealth to institute some of these reforms and really begin his campaign of westernizing Russia. So how does he westernize Russia? Let's talk about that next. A couple things. One, he introduces the potato. That seems really funny. We talked about the Columbian Exchange before 1500. Europeans did not have potatoes. And so he goes to the rest of Europe. He sees potatoes. He brings back the potato to Russia, and it becomes a staple in the diets of Russians. This is huge. It's really nutrient dense. It really supports populations. Remember, in Ireland, their population booms after the introduction of the potato because it's easy to grow. It grows in pretty hostile soil, and it's very nutrient rich. Next, he starts the first newspaper in Russia, and he actually edits the first edition himself. This is something that is common in Western Europe, are newspapers to disseminate news and knowledge and spread news and knowledge. So he begins that in Russia. Next, he raises women's status in society. So women actually get a boost in their status in society that mirrors more Western Europe than some of those Muslim empires. It can be argued that women do hold a pretty high status in some of the Muslim empires that we talk about. So I don't want that to be too much of a generalization. Just know that women's status under Peter I is raised. Next, he makes all of his nobles wear Western clothing. That might seem silly, but if you force all of your people to adopt new forms of clothing, it's really making them fully embrace the ideas of another culture. So he makes all of his nobles take Western clothing and start wearing Western clothing. They were wearing Crimean clothing before, which is more like that Middle Eastern style that we're used to, but he makes them all wear Western style clothing. Next, education and navigation, science, and the arts. So he promotes education in these areas. He helps found schools and develop schools that will teach people about navigation, science, and the art. And last, he gains control of a warm water port for Russia. This is huge. So now they have a warm water port and they can start trading with other countries. They can be importing and exporting goods. That is a huge turning point for Russia in their economy. So that is how Peter I took absolute control over his country and the reforms he instituted on his country. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about the rights of Englishmen and how absolutism didn't really take hold in England. Thanks for watching.